we've got a really very, very powerful panel this afternoon rather, for this critical thing about education. And I just wanted to share with you something that a conversation I had the other day with the head of education in Jamaica, who was saying that the feeling that boys have currently about education in Jamaica is causing such a fall off of their motivation. And the result of that is that the girls are not dating the boys because they feel that there's too wide a gap in their territory of interest. And this isn't a generalized statistic. This was a hugely frightening statistic, which she was saying is causing a disruption in civil society. Really because we have not been able to make many boys feel that education has purpose for them, matters to them, and that we're caring about the way that they're educated. So I don't know what our panel are going to talk about today because I haven't asked them all individually, but we have to care very much that we give boys the education that they need in the way that they need to get it, because that is what will make them a fully rounded person. And education, of course, isn't academic education. We're not just talking about that. We're talking about the whole person. Anyway, thank you to our panel in advance for giving the time today to do this. We've had many boys here doing mentoring. They're doing workshops all day, and it's great that their teachers feel this is an important session for them. But over to you, Sandy. You're facilitating this session. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, welcome to the session today. My name is Sandy Ruxton. I'm a freelance policy advisor, researcher. I trained as a languages teacher to work in secondary schools many years ago. I also worked in community education, particularly with male young offenders for a while, and since then I've been writing and researching around these areas as well. And most recently, I guess is relevant to the panel today, I was part of a research team at the Open University which was looking at the notion of male role models and what we mean by that. So everybody seems to think that male role models are a good thing for boys, but when you actually ask them in a bit more detail, what do you mean by a male role model, people have different answers to that. So maybe we'll discuss that issue a bit as well. And just to finish off, I'm on the advisory panel of a group called Great Men, who go into schools in London to work with boys around issues of emotion, relationships, violence, and so on. And I'm also an ambassador for the White Ribbon campaign, and I was delighted to see this week that the Labour front bench managed to agree on something, which was that they were going to all wear white ribbons on International Day Against Violence Against Women. So that's who I am. In terms of how we're going to run this session, the running order will be as we're sitting. So I'll just introduce the panellists to you. First, just to my left, I have Errol Lawson. He's Director of Emerge Leadership. He works developing workshops and mentoring programs, primarily for boys, I think, between 13 and 19. He's a pastor, motivational school speaker, he's a coach, and he's author of a book, From the Postcode to the Globe. So that's Errol. And then just beside Errol, we have Andy Wimbush, who's course convener, lecturer, and tutor at Cambridge University of Continuing Education. And he teaches English primarily, English literature, and also, I think, philosophy. So welcome, Andy. And then we have two people from the same organisation. We have Sean Sims, who is Service Development Manager at Working with Men, organisation based in London, working with boys and young men in many different contexts. And he's been working in education for 15 years, particularly boys in the sort of 11 to 19 age range. And finally, at the end, we have Anne Cayenne, who's conflict resolution development worker, also at Working with Men. She's got more than 10 years' experience working with young people in a variety of settings, and most notably within primary and secondary education and transition in inner London schools. So that's who our panel is today. The session is being recorded, so we're hoping there will be some kind of podcast. Could I ask you to put your mobile phones on silent? I don't think you have to turn them off, because you may want to tweet about what's going on here. I'm not sure if we have the Twitter hashtag. Yes, it's up there, Being a Man Fest. And that's it, really. So I think I'm going to pass it over to our panelists and they've all been asked to speak for 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm not going to be too hard on them, but on the other hand, we do need that everybody has a good chance to have a go. So, Errol, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So we've been asked to speak into the topic of how do we help boys to fulfill their potential in education. A couple of thoughts for me to kind of throw out and to share with you guys. I mean, I had the opportunity to work with young boys in schools up and down the country, mentoring them, and some from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think that if we're going to really help our young boys, I think at the highest level, first of all, there needs to be a conversation about what kind of future do we really want to have, and do we actually see a future within which our boys are succeeding, are achieving, are accomplishing academically, spiritually, socially, in every way, really, and do we really want that? And then acknowledge that something has to change. Something within our system is inherent, that is broken, and we have to change our approach. We have to acknowledge that first and foremost at the highest level. I think that we've got a system that is perhaps efficient but not effective, and we need to just have some more conversation at the top level. When working with boys, I find most of all with boys who are underachieving, one of the biggest problems they have is with boundaries. Oftentimes, boys are getting in trouble for speaking when they shouldn't be speaking or distracting others when they should be working, and there's no clear understanding of where the boundaries lie. And I think that can be drawn back to their home environment a lot of the time. In many cases, parenting is poor, or father is absent, or there's no structure in the home. And boys are coming to school and saying to themselves, well, if my mum lets me get away with that, if I can do it with mum, then how can you, sir, miss, tell me what to do? I won't listen to you either. And there's no sense of boundaries. And so this means that there's no respect for the other or for self. And I spend a lot of time trying to coach and mentor boys through this understanding of having respect for other, for whether it's teacher or peer, and also for self, and hopefully to establish some boundaries. I find that to be a real challenge, knowing when to do what and when not to do. And the other thing I find is communication. Working with boys and girls, girls we know perhaps have got a wider vocabulary a lot of the time, more open naturally to communicate their emotions, their feelings. I certainly find with boys, communication is a massive challenge. They're certainly smart, intelligent, but when you have them on a one-to-one, and you begin to talk about the future with them, talk about possibility, talk about where they could possibly be, and they are so far from having these conversations on a day-to-day basis. When you do engage them, they do communicate really powerfully. And we've got to create a space for them to have these kind of powerful conversations about their future and get their minds engaged with that possibility. And lastly, if I could maybe throw up, I think of maybe some solutions out there. I think the lines between masculinity and femininity have blurred to a point which, in the favor of girls, I would argue. And I think that we need to get back to a place where it's okay to be a man and it's okay to be a woman. And our boys is to know it's okay to be a man, and there are some values, maybe some core guiding principles that are good for men to have, and maybe we can help them to develop them and train them and coach them in doing some of those things, and that's okay, and us not being afraid of that. I'm not talking about hyper masculinity here, but just some things like character stuff that men need built into them in order for them to function healthily in society. My views.
Okay, thank you, Errol. Thanks for being brief and to the point. And you've raised some very important issues there. I noticed about boundaries, about parenting, respect, communication, and so on. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about those later. So shall we move on to Andy?
Okay, hello, everybody. I just want to begin with a caveat in that I'm not an educational specialist. I'm just an educational practitioner. And so what I want to offer here is not so much really informed wisdom, I suppose, but more like anecdotes and questions that have arose through my own practice as an educationalist, which hopefully we can answer with people who know more about the subject than me. So this is some questions that I've thought about through my own teaching work at the University of Cambridge, also through the Brilliant Club, which is a higher education access charity, getting children from low achieving state schools into top universities, and through similar programs I've worked on with the Sutton Trust and Teach First. So I teach literature, and I've noticed that the vast majority of students that I teach at university level and the kind of students who get put forward to these programs tend to be young women, girls, and also they tend to be very, very conscientious. So, like Errol was saying, girls feel a greater sense of ownership of their work. And so I want to consider two things out of this. I want to ask, is there a taboo against boys being conscientious, being devoted to their work in some way? And if so, why? I've often heard it said that the boys have a greater capacity for sort of risk and, playing things by the fly, which is why they tend to do well in exams at university, but they're often not quite as diligent in other areas such as coursework. And the other question is, are boys being dissuaded from those kind of humanities subjects where some sort of emotional capacity might be helpful? So, in the study of literature, emotion is not just an epiphenomenon that comes out of our study, like it would be for another subject. The joy of a scientific discovery is absolutely there, but in literature, paying attention to your emotions is a way of understanding the work that you're approaching. And I often say to my students, what you're doing when you open a literary text is you're working out what you feel and then sort of reverse engineering it, going back into the words, into the images, the vocabulary, and trying to find out how this writer is having this effect on you. And girls tend to be more willing to do this than boys. Boys tend to have what we call in literary studies the hermeneutics of suspicion, which means that that this writer is trying to affect me in some way, he's trying to get inside my mind and mislead me, and what they often do is they'll try and undermine that and pick it apart. And that's fine as far as it goes. It's an important skill, but it's not the only thing that is valuable in approaching a literary text. And I wonder whether there's maybe a taboo against some sort of emotional resonance with the work of art, a taboo against a kind of love that might come there. So I'll just give you one example of this that happened to me recently. I was working with a young man who was struggling with his work on Shakespeare. And we were working on King Lear. And if you know this play, there's a bit where Lear realizes that he's been a really bad king, and that he's been living in pomp and circumstance and great luxury whilst there are people in his kingdom who are very, very poor. And he just declares in his madness, "Take physic pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just." This is his moral epiphany. And what I noticed with this student was that he was very reluctant to take that on face value. He asked me, "Do you think maybe King Lear's being sarcastic here?" Which I was a bit troubled by, because it's taking the most important moral piece of this play and turning it into something very, very cynical. And I wonder whether there's a danger for young men in feeling that they can't respond to a work of literature with sincerity, with openness, with love, and with the kind of moral force that it might have. I suspect that this is the other half of the problem that we have with getting girls into STEM subjects as well.
Thanks, Andy. I think you've raised some very critical issues there, also about boys' conscientiousness, boys' diligence, boys' relationship with emotion as well, and that seems to me to be absolutely critical. So thank you for that. Sean.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you for having us. As an organisation, our focus is to educate and support boys and young men, but in particular we focus on sort of transitional periods within their lives, and education being a key theme. So for us, this is really an important issue. Based on my experience, observations and consultations with both young people and practitioners, we feel that there is a distinct lack of male presence within education. I think it's too simplistic to say that focusing on an increase of male presence within schools is going to change sort of the attitude to learning or their attainment, but I think it is definitely a contributing factor. So there are a number of areas that I'd like to touch on, considering gender bias and also the influence of male role models within schools. Considering the current landscape within education, speaking to the practitioners, almost all of the practitioners we consulted said there is a minimal male presence at Key Stage 1. They said that this stage of learning is focused primarily definitely on nurturing, and this is not necessarily a career path in education that men are pursuing for whatever reason. Some cited that it's maybe focused on the nurturing that is having an impact on whether they want to pursue their career in this direction at that point, or the focus on working with young people at this age. There's for men, maybe there is a situation where there's how we can say a sort of an over-reliance on that emotional attachment with young people. So for whatever reason, they say that there's not necessarily much of a presence at key stage 1, which is a crucial stage of education. And for young people at that stage, their engagement with education is solely dominated on both sides of the school gate by females. Speaking to Year 9 boys, a lot of the Year 9 boys said that role models were not something they saw in teachers. They said that teachers are something, some of them they respected, but were not necessarily people they looked at as role models. In terms of motivating them, the wider proportion of young people said they would speak more openly to female members of staff. Now, could this be potentially linked back to that nurturing that they were getting and their experience with education at an earlier stage? It's something that we need to really consider and think about. A number of boys did say, however, that they would prefer to speak to males. One boy in particular said, well, they understand what we go through. They've been there, they know what it's like to be a boy in this position. So again, it's a balance of who prefers to speak to females and who prefers to speak to males. Generally, boys stated that their attitude to learning was not necessarily gender-based. It was whether the teacher actually listened to them, whether they were fair, and whether they actually learned something within their class. Speaking to male practitioners within schools, a lot of them said that whilst there is a need for more male presence, this was not necessarily down to just simply having more males. It was about having a diverse population of males, but also about having a larger percentage of males in different positions within the school, so right throughout the structure of the school. So in conclusion, in relation to the lack of role models in school, I think at key stage 1, there is definitely a distinct lack of presence, and this is a real issue, and could potentially have a lasting impact on a boy's perception of the roles of men within education, and could also be perpetuating the stereotypical concept of females adopting that more nurturing role as opposed to men doing that within school. In terms of role models, supporting boys and impacting on their education and attitude to learning and aspirations can be achieved in many ways. And I don't think it's as simple as having more male models. I think personally that the schools need to be able to look to the wider community and engage families, entrepreneurs, business professionals, and enable them to have some form of connection with the young people. And this enables them to actually think about their career paths and how their education, what they're actually learning is connected to an actual career path and what they maybe want to pursue in life. The personal insights of these people and these professionals can provide a spark, can inspire young people, but as I say, can also provide support in terms of them moving into their career path. Internally, I think schools need to really be thinking about how they link the curriculum and aspects of what is actually being taught to young people to their aspirations and to what they would like to achieve outside of school. So, just thinking about what the actual contents of their lesson and how it's going to help them in terms of their career paths and moving forward. In relation to gender bias, this is a difficult one. I think the focus on pedagogy and reflective teaching practice will be one way of actually enabling the practitioners to consider gender bias and how this can potentially impact upon the way they teach and the way that the young people are actually learning. And this is just one of the ways in which I think that the reflective practice can help redress the situation in relation to gender bias.
Okay, thanks, Sean. I mean, clearly the issue of whether we have enough men in teaching, both in secondary and particularly in primary, is critical, and I'm sure we'll pick up some of those issues in the discussion later on, so thanks for that. Okay, your colleague, Anne Cayenne.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. As a female practitioner working solely with boys, between the ages of 10 and 14, I feel that I have the opportunity to discuss. I mean, everything we do is based on boys' development and advancing them and supporting them in achieving their potential. And when I think that when you start from year in reception all the way up to year 13, if they do A-levels, young people are in education for about 14 years. And within that time, there are key points where issues around attainment can be addressed and support offered. And I really believe in the importance of early intervention with young people, whether that be by staff within the schools or by outside organisations. So, for example, if we take reception, that's a key point that young people come in and they'll be assessed at that stage. There's lots that can be put in place for them at that stage because they will be looking at the baseline. I work quite considerably, do a lot of work with year sixes. So from year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, year 6 is another transition point for young boys because they've got their SATs and they're getting ready for moving into secondary school, where they're in year 7 and they're opened up to a lot more, a wider range of subjects and, looking at how they engage with those subjects. That we all know that there are lots more males in secondary school than in primary, but who do these young men look to as their role models? I ask that question, in the work that I do. I'm often asking them that question: who are your role models, and why have you chosen them? For boys between the ages of 10 and 14, many of them will pick young people that they identify with and they have some sort of connection with. In some way, whether that be through mutual interest or somebody who supported them, or they've developed a particular relationship with. Parents come up, mothers and older sisters quite often are role models for these young boys. So they won't always necessarily select a male person. If they do, it tends not to be teachers that they speak of. It's either older men in their lives or who they have some sort of social connection with. Relationships with teachers can be quite tricky for boys. So, as my colleague said, having more male teachers in school isn't on its own, in and of itself, the only answer. Because, sometimes relationships can be quite tricky, especially around the sort of 13, 14-year-old age group and, where boundaries are being established and, how that's done. All of these things can have an impact. And I think, when my work with these young boys, we look at lots of issues around this, and it's never an issue for them to talk to me about masculinity. When we start off, they might be very polite and not tell me what they really think, or try not to offend me, but that's fantastic for me, and they do that. But then when we get to the bottom of it, we have quite in-depth conversations about these things, and when I ask them whether they feel a female can support them in this way, many of them will say yes. Very rarely do they say no, very rarely. I think in terms of solution to attainment and support for young men, I think it's about really highlighting potential in young males, encouraging wider opportunities and starting conversations around their individual goals and aspirations, which is something that we do at Working with Men. Quite often, you never know when you speak to a young person whether you're the first person that's had that conversation with them about their targets and their goals and aspirations and what they want to do after GCSEs. And sometimes, on a number of occasions, I'll come up, young men will say to me, I haven't thought of that. Nobody's ever asked me about that. So sometimes, we may be the first, you never know. If you're working with young people, you can be the first person to have that conversation with them. So it's really about identifying areas of interest, highlighting their potential, I think, and building relationships with them. And actually, we mustn't forget the parents in all of this, to encourage parental support and, catch young people at the transition point. So whether it be when they come in at reception or when they're going from year 6 to 7 or when they're in year 11 and they're going over to do their, their A-levels, or even before that when they're choosing their options and they want to know what's available to them. All of these things I think are important in addressing sometimes the disparity between the levels of attainment between boys and girls. So it's really for me about opening up the conversation to them and just starting the conversation about these things.
Okay, thanks Anne very much. I mean, you pointed to us a number of other issues as well, so transition points in boys' lives, particularly in the early years. Who are role models for boys? And I think, an interesting perspective on women's role and the role of mothers, sisters, grandmothers, and so on in role modelling as well. And I had one or two things that I wanted to ask the panel first, which are kind of general things really. And I suppose the first one, which it seems to me to be a bit of a critical question around boys and achievement, is which boys are we talking about and which girls are we talking about? Now, we so often talk about boys and girls being homogenous groups, and of course they're not. And very often we find that there's more difference within the groups than there are between boys and girls. So I think that's quite an interesting starting point. And I think there's also issues around the role of social class in particular. There are huge differences in social class between middle-class boys and working-class boys, and we need to get that on the table, and we also need to think about the interrelationship with race and ethnicity and other equalities issues as well. So it's a bit of a big question, but I thought I'd just throw it open and see if anybody wants to pick that up and comment on some of the issues around equalities and which boys we're really talking about here.
I think from our perspective, what we tend to find is that when it comes to anything to do with behaviours, it's always a particular demographic that we find that we're working with, particularly in the inner city schools within London. And again, like you say, within that demographic, there are differences in terms of their ethnicity, sort of class differences as well. But yeah, it's for us, it's an issue because what happens is that when the groups come together, a lot of the times they look around and say, well, it's us again. Mm. And it has an impact on the way that they actually engage. And, for some of them thinking, well, okay, this is racial. So they have different issues in terms of the way that they see the educators and the way that they feel that they're perceived within schools.
Yeah. And as I understand it, in terms of race, there are different achievements between different racial groups. So, for example, Chinese and Indian boys tend to do quite well, and Pakistani and Bangladeshi boys do far less well. Yeah. So, that's quite an interesting issue as well. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, even when we look at that group, a lot of the times we find that in some of the schools that we've been working in more recently, we're finding that the white British boys, some of those working class boys, are the boys who are struggling the most academically. Mm. And even within, more recently I spoke to across the Federation, and they said amongst their African Caribbean groups, they're finding that it's the African boys who seem to be going the other way. And some of the Caribbean boys seem to be on the increase, and that's the only reason why they established that was because they actually started to look at them more singular. But that seems to be a trend within that federation.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment on these issues on the panel?
I think in terms of social class, I mean, if we're asking the question about, we're raising the issues around role models and a lack of role models within schools, then clearly we're looking at particular boys where there's a suggestion there that perhaps we might be looking at boys from single parent households or boys from a particular demographic, particular social class. I think that, the aspirations can vary, and when we work with, and sometimes boys can have a real strong sense of justice of how they're perceived by other people when they get to a certain age, and even when you look at between boys and girls, sometimes boys will be very clear that, in schools, teachers are they're much less severe with the girls, than they are with them. And that, it's not fair. We get a lot of that. It's not fair. And, we're not being treated the same way. And I think sometimes, in terms of aspiration, there can be very low aspirations for some boys, but they themselves are what they think they can achieve. So I think, there are wide differences in the sorts of, it's not just simple as, being, from a particular race or class. There's lots of different things, really, which come together.
And I guess another element too is that we tend to assume that all girls are doing well, whereas of course we have to remember that some girls are not doing doing well as some of the boys too.
And some boys do very well.
Critical
indeed.
part of it.
Yeah.
But maybe we should also talk about the role modelling issue a bit more, because several people on the panel have raised that, and so it's been said that we need more men in schools, in teaching, in primary schools, in particular. But I suppose that raises a question: if we want more men in these positions, what actually do we want from them? What are the qualities that we might want from the male role models in schools? What are they going to provide that female teachers apparently can't provide? Or is there not very much difference?
Yeah, I think that role modeling is an issue. I wonder whether young people actually identify consciously that they have a role model or that they're modeling themselves on somebody. And so, for example, in one school working in Oxford right now with some year 11 boys who are underachieving, and the head teacher said to me, well, a lot of their parents, and I've asked them themselves as well, that a lot of their parents are doing jobs, they're either mechanics or they're, sort of labour, bricklayers, things of that nature. And you ask them what do they want to be, and they want to be a mechanic, I want to be and so they don't see the connection between education in the here and now and that goal. They don't feel like they need that. And so when you ask them, it's, well, that's what dad's doing, or that's what my brother's doing. And so there's a shaping happening in their aspirations and their mindsets based on those early relationships. And I think that's a factor. I think when we're saying do we want male role models in schools, we need them to see that there are leaders, I believe, that there are men who are leading with grace and with compassion and with care, and that they can be safe around. Because I think the issue is often intimacy for boys, and you touched on it a bit earlier as well, about intimacy with men in particular, when a lot of the times the male figures in our life either weren't reliable, weren't there, weren't present, whatever. And so we have a challenge to be intimate with men, so we can do the banter, we can do the ribbing, and we can do all that stuff, but to be intimate about who we really are and our deepest emotions and feelings, we struggle with that. But if there are men around us that model that to us in our schools or wherever in society, that model to us in a safe and healthy way, I believe that will help them to form healthy opinions of themselves and what they're capable of achieving.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment? Do you want to comment, Andy, at all on that?
Yeah, I just agree with what Errol said, really, that I think it's important that the boys feel that they have a kind of alternative version of masculinity, perhaps the one they've been given from a young age, particularly around that age of sort of 13, 14. There's, I suppose, forms of masculinity that aren't necessarily that helpful to them, because it's such an age where you're so competitive with each other, and there's a kind of one-upmanship all the time, and but not necessarily competitive in a constructive way. And actually, throughout their teenage years, it's very important that those other male figures come into their lives who do, as you said, provide that kind of compassionate, perhaps more sensitive outlook, and that doesn't, as you said, doesn't take away from their being a man or making them feminine or anything like that. It can be another form of it.
Yeah. I think just to add to that as well, what we find is that when you speak to a lot of the young boys from sort of Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 3, they say that in primary school there's a lot more contact, so there's a lot more in the way of that sort of nurturing, arm round if something's wrong. But as soon as you go to secondary school, it all changes, and you're expected to be upright. Crying there's no way you can be seen crying. And in terms of contact as well, boys coming into any contact, unless it's play fighting or real fighting or a tackle, then you don't touch each other. And I mean, to be honest, in conversations you ask them, they associate that with being gay. And that's, it's the worst slander that, they use towards each other. So, just to be called gay is something that they feel, well, okay, that's the worst thing. So to be seen to be having any contact within school is not the done thing. So even in terms of the work that we do, we encourage some, small contact teamwork and things where they actually are having some physical contact, and then move that on to actually having deeper level conversations where they're able to speak about their emotions. Right. And providing examples of how that's done, and giving examples of even men who struggle to speak about their emotions and the potential impact. So there's a lot of in the public eye now about men's mental health and boys' mental health, and we get them to speak about the impact of bottling up and keeping things in, and they can tell you So being able to be in a sort of a round table where they're able to discuss these things, and like you said, discuss it with somebody maybe who they look up to, or anybody who can just provide them with that safe space where they can do it amongst their peer groups is very important. Do you?
I mean, I had a conversation about just that with some of my Year 8 boys this week. You know, and you sort of talking about emotions, and I said to them, you know, they do associate a lot of that physical contact with intimacy, and you know, in terms of, they just don't want to do it. And when you're in primary school, you see them hanging out, hugging each other, but there comes a point where they're older, and they just don't want to do it. And I asked the question, when did this happen? If I would sat with you in reception or year 1, you wouldn't be answering in this way, but there's a point at which that changes. And I think that I pick up on what Errol was talking about, just for them to be able to feel that they can be intimate with somebody. You know, their peer groups, they just don't have it. Many of them will say that, you know, when I ask the question, who would you speak to? If something was troubling you, who would you go to? Many of them will say they won't talk to their male friends. They'll go to, if they have female friends, they'll talk to them. They'll always take it to the females. They don't really want to, at that age group, they don't want to be really talking to other men of their own age. And certainly they don't want any physical contact. By the time they're 13 or 14, they just don't.
I think it's fascinating the emphasis you're all putting on relationships, intimacy, emotion, all of these things, and it's so key. I mean, when I was asking the question, I thought somebody might say, well, of course, you know, there are programs which really are about strengthening discipline in schools, and, you know, there's a view that that's what male teachers can do. So if you think of, for instance, the Troops to Teachers program, introducing ex-soldiers into secondary schools, or bolstering cadet forces. I mean, to me, there's a particular kind of masculinity which is being promoted through programs like that. And I have to agree with the panel here that I think that's actually going in the wrong direction. And what we really should be focusing on is what you're all talking about. So intimacy, relationships, emotion. I hope we can continue this important discussion about where we go with education, where we go with education and boys, where we go with education and gender. And I wanted to thank all our panellists first. I wanted to thank you for being in the audience and listening, and hope we can continue the conversation. So thank you so much.